We turn now to our next item of business, consideration of Business Motion 22053 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out revisions to this week's business. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion? Thank you very much, Minister. And Mr Finlay, do you wish to speak on this motion or just pressing early? That's fine. No member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. The question therefore is that motion 22053 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. So we're going to turn now to topical questions. Our first question today is from Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the review into the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
As members know, I commissioned the independent review in January 2019 with the remit to establish whether the design, build, commissioning and maintenance of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and the Royal Hospital for Children has had an adverse impact on the risk of healthcare-associated infection and whether there is wider learning for NHS Scotland. I have welcomed the report which was published yesterday and its important findings, recommendations and the contribution it will make to the public inquiry and will respond fully to its findings and recommendations in due course. In thanking Dr Fraser and Dr Montgomery for their considerable work, I also want to put on record again my sincere thanks to the whistleblowers for their courage and persistence in the face of the difficulties that were placed in their way. I do recognise, though, that for some of the families affected, the report does not provide all the answers they rightly ask for, but I hope that the outcome of the independent case review which is underway, and our response to both will assure them of the extreme seriousness with which I take their concerns.
I welcome that response from the Cabinet Secretary. This is a small step in the right direction, but it does sadly leave many big unanswered questions. As the Health Secretary has said, this is one part of several pieces of work, but it is crucial that any process takes the families affected with them. That isn't helped by clear inconsistencies. On one hand, the co-authors say that this review wasn't about looking at individual cases and therefore they didn't speak to families, but at the same time their report does make judgments on individual cases. That isn't acceptable. Success or failure will depend on getting answers from Millie's parents and all the parents affected. Will the Cabinet Secretary give a firm commitment that families will be at the heart of the next stages, namely the clinical case review and the public inquiry?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm very happy to give the member, Mr Sarwar, that assurance. As he probably knows, following my meeting with a number of the families involved, we undertook a number of actions. One of those was to place a very senior clinical member of my team into Queen Elizabeth University Hospital as a direct liaison between the board and the families to ensure that where families had a range of questions on any matter, that he ensured that they were given the answers speedily and fully, and he continues to do that work. Families have been involved in the work of the Oversight Board and the design of that work, and in assisting in developing how the independent case review will go forward. Individual families related to specific cases that will be independently reviewed both are aware, but also have the option of being alongside the case review while it happens or not, depending on how they want to be engaged with that. Certainly being involved and having the findings of the case review fully reported in person to them, with many opportunities, as many as they need, to return with further questions that they might have in all of that. And finally, with respect to the public inquiry, the remit of the public inquiry has now been, it was considered by the families involved in order to ensure that its remit met what they hoped it would do. Members here were given, through their party health spokespersons, the opportunity to comment as well. That remit is now finalised. I will speak to Lord Brodie later this week and hope following that to be able to update the Chamber on when the public inquiry will begin. But Lord Brodie has been keen from the very outset to understand how he can best engage with the families involved, and I understand intends to appoint a family liaison officer to the public inquiry to ensure that that happens.
And that's Sarwar.
The authors of this review accept that their report was about the future, not the past. But the past matters, especially for those that have lost a child. Because there are undisputable facts. The Queen Elizabeth was built with design flaws. The independent water report at the time of opening found that there was high risk of infection. These reports were not actioned at the time. There were infections in children. Millie Mayne did die from a stenotrophomonas infection. It's written on her death certificate. There is a culture problem, and there was an attempt by the leadership of the Health Board to ridicule and silence whistleblowers. Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that the public inquiry must look at these issues and provide answers? And will she also publicly support Millie's parents' demands for a fatal accident inquiry so they can try and get justice and answers on their daughter's death? Cabinet Secretary.
So I do completely agree with the member that the past does matter. And it is often that past and the unanswered questions around that past that many of the families desperately require answers. And so I completely concur. And I believe that the public inquiry will work very hard in order to address that. And it does need to look at the past in order to provide both the answers but also any lessons that we need to learn for the future infrastructure build in our NHS. But I also think so too is the independent case review, which is with independent experts in their field looking case by case, which is also looking at the past. And I hope all the families involved who have been contacted choose a way of engaging with that case review that best meets their needs. And as I said, they have a range of reviews. I understand that Ms Darrow's case, Millie's case, has been reported to the Procurator Fiscal, and they need to go through their due process within which it would not, as I know Mr Sarwar understands, be appropriate for me to intervene. I think we need to let that happen. We need to let the public inquiry begin, and we need to see how Millie's mum feels as a consequence of the case review in her daughter's case, and then we will see if there are further steps that we need to take.
Thank you. I note there are 7 members who would like to ask a question on this, but I don't think we'll get them all in. But succinct questions and answers too, please. Miles Briggs to be followed by David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I had 2 points. Firstly, on the 28th of January, the Cabinet Secretary told me that the 80 families who had been identified, at the very least, that they would have a face-to-face talk-through with regards to their specific case. Can I ask, has that actually happened? And with regards to yesterday's report, one of the points was the impact of benefits of the single rooms should be reviewed and that any future design should be considered around that. Is it now the Scottish Government's view that they will review single bed occupancy in hospitals?
Cabinet Secretary.
So with respect to the face-to-face talk-through, part of the work of the independent case note review has been delayed. It is taking longer, as you might expect, because of COVID-19, and the independent reviewers are working through different ways by which they can have that face-to-face talk-through, but the commitment remains. They have undertaken some of that and they will take longer, so it is now anticipated that the initial report will be available in the autumn. That may not be the complete report. It depends how they can meet both the commitment of the face-to-face talk-through and also do so in a circumstance where we are still dealing with COVID-19. In terms of single rooms, what I note from an initial reading, and I will read it again more than once, I am sure, of the report, is that the specific point that was picked up was in terms of the maintenance of particularly wash hand basins and the water supply in single rooms, where inevitably as a single room the water flow was not as great as if you were in a 4-bedded bay where the water would be getting used more often. And so there was a maintenance issue that was not picked up and addressed at the outset, and that is part of what we need to consider as we progress, because we know that single rooms also play an important role in effective infection prevention and control, notwithstanding the points that the report makes in that regard.
David Torrance to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, what role will the national body announced in the programme for government to strengthen infection prevention and control have in ensuring that we have a wide range of skills and expertise required for the construction of these particularly complex structures going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the national body that has been announced and on which progress is being made, albeit slower than we would have anticipated before COVID-19, but progress is being made, will have a critical role, because if we simply take the lessons that are in this independent review, notwithstanding Mr Sarwar's comments about where he would have liked it to have gone and his concerns around it, which I hope we will discuss later, notwithstanding that, there are clear lessons in that. The national body will hold those lessons around single rooms, for example, maintenance schedules and the kind of maintenance that should be made and the design that should be there in the outset, where you need to find a better balance, for example, between energy efficiency and the right airflow, particularly for groups of patients who are immune suppressed. So the creation of a build like the Queen Elizabeth needs to be able to flex what it is doing dependent on the particular needs and vulnerabilities of different patient cohorts, and that has to be a key lesson to be learned even from this review, far less what the public inquiry will teach us.
Alison Johnson to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. The review's findings state that some of the difficulties encountered with water and ventilation systems were the result of ambiguity concerning the status and interpretation of guidance. And the independent review of the government arrangements for the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People likewise found that the issue with ventilation and critical care stemmed from confusion over interpretation of standards and guidance. So why is it that these critical errors keep being made in the building of our hospitals, and what assurance can the Cabinet Secretary give that clear guidance will be produced in future and that that guidance will be followed?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there would be an argument to say that the guidance is clear, and in both instances what Ms Johnson is referring to is local interpretation of the guidance. Part of the point of the National Centre and the role it will have in the sign-off of design, of build, of guidance is that we remove the opportunity for local interpretation of guidance, and we have clear national guidance, a single interpretation of that guidance, and we remove some of the areas of perceived ambiguity that are there because you get that local interpretation. But you also have in one place a body of experience and expertise moving from one infrastructure project to another with a degree of consistency and skill that you don't get if you leave it up to each individual board.
Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The failure of mechanical ventilation to change over the air in the new sick kids, the critical care elements of the new sick kids, was the reason the move was halted and the reason that we are having to effect remedial changes to that building at a cost of many millions of pounds. Can I ask, given that the same problem has been identified in the QEUH, what remedial work is now required to effect changes to ensure the adequate airflow in that hospital?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the remedial work in the Queen Elizabeth campus has already been done. Again, as with other areas, it has been slowed because of the response to the pandemic, because it is internal construction work. So even in the first phase of the easing for the construction industry, it was not possible, in particular because of where it is. This is around wards 2A and 2B in the Children's Hospital, where there has been considerable initial work done, but not yet completed, to ensure that the ventilation flows and the air changes are exactly what is needed across both 2A and 2B. Initially, the intention was simply one part, but now the decision has been made quite rightly that it should be across both of those wards. That is the reason why, if member remembers, children or patients and families were decanted from that area to wards 6A and B in order to allow that to happen. So that work is underway. It will be completed. I don't yet have the final timeline of that. That's partly to do with construction supply as well as construction work. But as soon as I have the final timeline for that, again, I'll make sure that members know. And that will then need to be signed off both by all the regulatory bodies before I will agree that children can move back into that area.
And Monica Lennon.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, what assurance can you give that the terms of the public inquiry will allow for proper scrutiny of the decisions taken by the government and successive ministers in respect of the QUH and the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Edinburgh? And notwithstanding your comments about family engagement, some families are feeling quite upset and let down by the process so far and fear there's been a cover-up. What is your response to those families?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there certainly has been absolutely no attempt by me to cover up anything in this regard. I think that we have taken a number of steps to try and ensure that families are heard, that they are, where they have shared concerns, that those shared concerns are addressed. That is Professor White's daily role and has been for a number of weeks. But also where there are individual family issues around their child's case and how that case has been managed and whether or not there has been an impact on the management or the treatment for that child or the outcomes in those tragic cases where children have died as a consequence of the environmental issues, that the independent case review has a very clear determination to do that with a level of family engagement that the families themselves will determine. And as I've already said, Lord Brodie has been clear from the outset that he wants to personally hear directly from families about their own concerns and their own issues. And as I've already said too, the draft remit that he was content with was circulated to families engaged and affected at Queen Elizabeth and the Children's Hospital there for their comments, which were then incorporated into what will be the final remit that we will publish. So I think that a great deal of work has gone on to ensure that that happens. Of course, how Lord Brodie conducts his inquiry is entirely for him. It is a statutory inquiry with a number of significant powers. I think that he has been very thoughtful before he agreed to chair the inquiry, because he is determined to get to the bottom of a number of issues that he's already identified he feels need to be drilled down into. And that does include the role and decision-making of government, where he thinks that has been, and concludes whether or not he thinks that has been appropriate or whether he thinks that mistakes and failures have been made there. And he will, I believe, and I'm certain, without fear or favour, pursue his public inquiry in the manner that he thinks is correct. I can't tell him how to do it, and I wouldn't dream of doing that, so he will get on and do that. In terms of whether or not there is more that we can do in order to address questions that families still have, I remain, as I always have been, very open to meet with, to speak to and to hear individual families' concerns and see if there is anything more that I can do to address those.
Thank you very much, and apologies to Neil Findlay and Daniel Johnson, but we have to move on to the next question, which is from Jamie Green.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide further clarity to comments by the Deputy First Minister that schools could adopt a part-time learning model for the whole of the next academic year.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
President Officer, I indicated on Sunday that we do not want the blended learning model to go on for a moment longer than it is required for public health reasons. And we want young people to be back having face-to-face learning for 100% of the school week as soon as it is safe to do so. Ensuring our children and young people have the highest quality education is of critical importance. To that end, our regular 3-weekly reviews of the coronavirus regulations will include specific consideration of the evidence and data relating to transmission within schools and amongst young people. Where that suggests specific restrictions on safety can be lifted or eased without putting pupils and teachers at undue risk, we will take that course of action.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response? My inbox, as I suspect is the case with others, is full on this matter. Parents across Scotland were justifiably concerned and angry this weekend. They're concerned over how they can possibly return to work with their children only being educated part-time. And they're angry that no one in the government can give them clear answers to fundamental questions about their child's education next year. Instead, we've seen mixed messages, confusion and a chronic lack of leadership on this. The Cabinet Secretary in the morning telling broadcasters that part-time schooling could last all of next year, only to be undermined by the First Minister a few short hours later. So on behalf of parents And to help the Cabinet Secretary clear up any confusion on this, let me ask a simple question. Knowing that we cannot rely on a vaccine for this virus anytime soon, by what date do you, the Cabinet Secretary for Education, believe that schools will return to normal?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I made clear in my first answer, I want schools to return to normal as quickly as it is safe for that to happen. And the government is working with our local authority partners through an agreed framework, which has been discussed and agreed with the teaching professional associations and with representatives of the parental community to ensure that we have a workable approach to sustain the learning of children and young people, part of which will happen within school and part of which will happen at home, supported by a range of digital learning support that is available just now and will be strengthened as we approach the resumption of the school term in August. So we will, as I said in my earlier answer, bring to an end blended learning whenever it is safe to do so. And I acknowledge that this is a challenging period for parents, but I also have communication from many, many parents about the importance of ensuring that our schools are safe places for children and young people to go to. And I'm sure Parliament will understand the importance that I have to attach to ensuring that our schools are in fact safe places for children in which to be educated.
Jamie Green.
Thank you for that further response. The Cabinet Secretary is essentially saying he cannot give a date. But the First Minister was able to say yesterday that the blended model, I quote, will not last a year or anything like it. Which means what exactly, Cabinet Secretary? Parents and pupils need more detail, and we're getting two competing messages from government's two most senior ministers on this. Since the Education Secretary does not know if or when schools will fully reopen, perhaps he can answer some questions that he should know the answer to. Can he tell us how much additional classroom capacity schools could deliver if social distancing was reduced to 1 metre? Can he tell us how many additional teachers have been recruited since March to deal with his plans for blended learning? And can he guarantee the Chamber today that children will be able to access the same breadth of subjects next academic year as was available to them this year?
Cabinet Secretary.
The first thing to say to Mr Green is that the blended learning model is a product of agreement between the Scottish Government, local authorities, the teaching professional associations and also parents. So it has been worked on for some weeks since the lockdown began to ensure that we had an agreed framework that could be deployed locally to maximise the impact and the effect of education on young people. Now, the questions of school occupancy are of course varied around the country, as Mr Green will know. As I explained to the Education Committee on Friday, there are some schools that operate significantly under occupancy, and those schools in many cases will be able to deliver an almost full timetable for children and young people. There are of course schools at the other end of the spectrum which have much more significant roles and may be close to capacity or even in some circumstances over capacity. So they have to manage very carefully the accommodation that's available to them. And what the strategic framework puts in place is the facility for local authorities and the requirement on local authorities to maximise available accommodation and available staff resources. Now, that's what we expect to see from local authorities, and that will vary because of the options that are available around the country. But what we will be looking for in the plans that come forward from local authorities is detail on how they are maximising the use of accommodation, maximising the recruitment of staff, and the General Teaching Council is in the process of contacting staff who are not currently teaching or registered teachers who are not currently teaching to assess their availability to support the expansion of learning models around the country.
Thank you. Ian Gray to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government produced a detailed route map for the reopening of economic and social life. It's not perfect, but at least it is a timetable plan towards normality for every part of Scotland. So why on earth was there no route map for a return to full-time school for every pupil in Scotland, which is, after all, their right?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Mr Gray has obviously not been reading carefully enough, because that is precisely what the strategic framework does. It underpins the importance of restoring full-time education for young people at the earliest possible opportunity, that it is safe for us to do that for staff and pupils. And if Mr Gray is prepared to be cavalier with the safety of staff and pupils, then he is welcome to that view, but it is not one that I share.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Willie Rennie. Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The cost of providing blended education will be different for each local authority, and we don't yet know how long it will last. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide a best estimate of both educational and financial impact across Scotland for each month that blended learning remains in place? And will local authorities be permitted to end blended learning and return to normal when they consider it appropriate to do so?
Cabinet Secretary.
The assessment of financial issues will flow from the development of local authority plans to deliver the blended learning approach around the country. That commitment was given in the strategic framework which the government published in May, and it will be the subject of detailed discussion as we assess and consider the plans that are put forward by individual local authorities. And Mr Gibson is absolutely correct. That will vary from area to area across the country.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
The mammoth effort to get our health service ready for the virus and protect our businesses from the virus has not been replicated for young people's education. If parents had been asked to return to work by the Scottish Government has an obligation to make provisions for full-time childcare. If the school hours are cut in half, childminders have been cut back and grandparents are not allowed to look after their kids, who exactly is going to look after them?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Mr Rennie does a disservice to the significant amount of work that is being done by educators the length and breadth of the country to deliver learning in the extremely challenging circumstances that we currently face. And if Mr Rennie will not pay tribute to the teachers who are delivering that education, then I am very pleased to do so, to make sure that teachers understand that the government appreciates and values the contribution they are making in very difficult and challenging circumstances.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
That the government has taken.
Sorry, Cabinet Secretary, please finish.
The route map the government has set out indicates very clearly the relationship between the resumption of economic activity and working activity and the resumption of school activity in the country. Those must go hand in hand. That is the design of the route map, and further details on that will be shared with Parliament by the First Minister on Thursday.
Thank you. And Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you. Bruce Adamson, the Children's Commissioner, said, "We know that home-based learning that they have been doing just doesn't work, and it is no substitute whatsoever for real-life school-based education." He said the proposals for blended learning were heavily based on home learning, and that is going to have a real impact on children's right to education, and that we need to do much better. Do you need to do much better, Cabinet Secretary?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I indicated in my earlier answers, the government has formulated a framework for the resumption of full-time schooling in partnership with our local authority colleagues, with the professional associations and with parents, to make sure that we resume early learning as early as we possibly can do. Now, I've accepted publicly, I accepted in front of the Education Committee on Friday, that blended learning is not as good a model as the model of delivery of education we had in place before COVID. And we have to resume full-time education as early as we possibly can do. But I have to deal with the reality that the scientific and clinical advice to me just now does not enable us to restore full-time learning in schools. We will do that at the earliest possible opportunity, but I'm sure Parliament understands the importance of us listening to and following carefully the scientific and clinical advice that is available to us, because the safety of children and staff must be paramount in the decisions that we take.
Thank you very much. Question number 3, Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to violent scenes that took place in George Square, Glasgow at the weekend.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
Well, I was completely appalled by the shameful scenes that took place in George Square last Sunday. Firstly, because, of course, there never is any excuse for violence or intimidation, but also because our police officers have been at the very front line of keeping us safe during this pandemic. To then face the disorder, as we witnessed on Sunday, is simply unacceptable. These scenes were very much in stark contrast to the peaceful Black Lives Matter demonstrations that took place in Scotland the week before. Can I remind everyone that we continue to be in a crisis situation, and mass gatherings of people put the lives of our citizens and frontline public service workers at risk. The First Minister and I have been crystal clear in supporting everyone's right to protest, but have called on those wishing to protest to consider alternative ways, such as use of social media and digital means to do this.
Sandra White.
I thank the Minister for that response. He will be obviously aware about Tommy, a photographer who is a Chinese gentleman in Glasgow, was racially abused and punched on the head. According to Tommy, he was threatened with action by the police if he did not leave. A staff member of the Herald was also there, and I quote for the staff member, went along to George Square today, folk patrolling the perimeter, threatening people who are taking photos. After being approached by a few of these men, I deleted most of my pictures. Can the Cabinet Secretary please outline what action the police can and should take in these circumstances, and why no action was taken on Saturday against these thugs?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I was deeply moved by Tommy Gakawan's comments and the story of his really disgraceful incident that he had to face. I know, as somebody who's also faced very much publicly racist abuse, how hurtful it can be, but I read his account in the Glasgow Times this morning and was deeply moved by it, but also very ashamed that we live in a country where somebody would have to suffer that sort of racial abuse. So let me give absolute full solidarity to Tommy during this difficult time. In relation to the specific question that Sandra White raises, I've spoken to Police Scotland over the years, even before I was Justice Secretary, but particularly in this current role, with the most senior police officers, Chief Constable, his DCCs, his ACCs, about hate crime. And there is absolute zero tolerance for hate crime in whichever form it may take. In terms of the specific incident that she refers to and the disappointment that Tommy has expressed in his in the story as he has articulated it, and Sandra White has rehearsed that, what I would say is, of course, policing is operational to the Chief Constable. So if she hasn't already done so, she should, of course, write to the Chief Constable, and he will undoubtedly respond. But also, if Tommy is equally unhappy with Police Scotland's actions in this regard, in this particular incident, he also, of course, can make a formal complaint in that regard. And if he's not satisfied with that complaint to Police Scotland, he can make a complaint to the PERC as well in relation to the handling of that complaint. So there are avenues by which that can be taken forward.
Andrew White.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I have written to the police, haven't had a reply yet, and I have offered to speak with Tommy, which I already had. I wouldn't put forward anything that he hadn't already said it was okay to do so. Cabinet Secretary, these people were thugs. I witnessed helicopters, mounted police, police motorbikes, police vans, police, and yet the whole of the square was closed down to ordinary people walking about. But whilst I say these people were thugs and the actions they took were criminal, I think there's more to that. I really believe that it depicts the ignorance of people in regards to the history of slavery, colonisation, and the intolerance which we see follows from that ignorance of the history. So can I maybe go a wee bit further and ask that this subject be taught in our schools, under school curriculum? And I think a really good place to start would be the TV programme, which is presented by David Heyman, and it's Slavery, Scotland's Hidden Shame. So I would ask perhaps if you would speak with the Cabinet Secretary of Education, because this all stems from sheer ignorance of the fact of what happened all those years and years ago. Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Andrew White, for her question. Can I first and foremost say that I absolutely agree with her characterisation that these individuals involved were thugs. There's just no getting away from that. And I specifically referenced the point in my opening remarks that the scenes that we saw in Glasgow on Sunday were in stark contrast to the scenes that we saw the previous weekend in Glasgow by those who were participating in Black Lives Matter protests in Scotland. In terms of her substantial point, the Deputy First Minister, and I have had this conversation, he can obviously give Sandra White more details, but of course the Curriculum for Excellence does allow the opportunity for the slave trade to be taught and Scotland's role in that to be taught in our schools. If there is something further that we can and should do in that regard, certainly, I know the Deputy First Minister would be happy for me to say we could absolutely actively explore that. And what I would say, you know, for all the negatives, and there are many of them that have been raised by the Black Lives Matters movement, certainly one of the silver linings or the opportunities is that it has certainly forced us, I think, as a nation to confront that past in a way that I don't, certainly in my lifetime, I don't think we have. So I suppose the message would be, let's not waste that opportunity and make sure that we educate not just ourselves, but our future generations on the role that Scotland played in the slave trade.
Thank you very much. And my apologies to James Kelly and Patrick Harvey, who've been waiting patiently to ask a supplementary, but we've run out of time. Can I have to move on to the next item of business?